Welcome to the interview portion of Power Talk. I'm here today and privileged to be with a gentleman that I'm sure you're familiar with. If I'm introducing you to him, you haven't been around very much. It's probably more of a reintroduction, and that is Dr. Wayne Dyer. We're here in Hawaii in his escape route where he's writing another book. And if you're not familiar with Wayne, you should be. Certainly he's written some of the best-selling books of all time in the area of personal development. Your Erroneous Zones, Pulling Your Own Strings, The Sky's the Limit, Gifts from Icus, and You'll See It When You Believe It. Wayne, I just want to first thank you for letting me get a chance to share with your family.
It was great. Wasn't that great?
Yeah, that was great. I walked in to see Wayne and his family, and I got attacked by 7 children.
Kids know, though, Tony. I was really impressed because when they walked in, my children are very open and very loving, but very often a stranger will walk in and they are very skeptical and they check you out first, like animals do. And they jumped right onto you. So I think there's an invisible quality that people send out. And I think if you have a love for children, that says an awful lot about you. And of course I have it in great depth because my children are the most important things in my life. Yeah. And I can tell that you're a wonderful daddy too. It's nice having you there.
I appreciate that very much. Well, I think one of your gifts, from my perception, is the ability to have that child be totally alive inside of you. And that's where happiness comes from when it's natural. But why don't we start out by getting we always start our Power Talks finding a little background on people.
Sure.
So why don't you tell us, where did this philosophy of no limits, this lifestyle of really living life to the fullest, where did all this come from for you? Where did it start? I know you had some painful challenges starting out in your childhood.
Yeah, well, they were challenges. They weren't painful.
Oh, that's good.
Truly, they weren't. See, I grew up I spent 6 or 7 years in a series of foster homes. My mother had 3 boys by the time she was just a very young woman, and my father had spent some time in prison, and he was abusive and an alcoholic and an irresponsible person, and he stole from everyone, and this is why he went to jail. And he also just abandoned his family when I was just an infant. I was born in 1940, and my brothers were born in 38 and 36, so there was a depression at that time. It was a horrible financial times. My mother was working as a candy girl for Kresge's on the east side of Detroit, making $17 a week and trying to feed 3 children and figure out how to deal with the beatings that she was getting and the abuse and so on. So I ended up in a series of foster homes with my brother. My oldest brother went with my grandmother, and we were all reunited when I was almost 10. I come from a position at this point in my life that there are no accidents, that the universe is on purpose.
I agree.
And I know I know your material as well as you know mine. I listen to your tapes and read your books and know that we have a lot of similarities there. And I think that the childhood experiences that you get, even the ones that we, quote, call painful, are lessons. And there are exams given, and we either pass them or we just keep repeating
the same
them.
lesson,
that's right, over and over again. Yeah. And so I look back upon that. I try to look back very objectively on those years when I was in a foster home and in the years when I was away from my mother and things were happening that everybody else would sort of categorize as horrible and painful. And when you're a kid, you don't wake up every day and say, I'm an orphan again today, isn't this awful?
Yeah. Unless somebody teaches you to think that way.
That's right, unless you process. And I was always the one in the places that I lived where a mother would bring in a new child. It was just, all it was just poverty. I mean, it was just, nobody had anything. And so everybody that ended up in these various homes was just because they didn't have anything. It wasn't anything other than that. And the mothers would bring their children in, or the church would bring a child in, and they'd always say, go get Wayne. And I was always out and back either playing or meditating or having a good time, because it was on a farm like. I mean, there were chicken coops and there was a lot of apple trees and peach trees, and it was just, to me, it was just where I was. I mean, what else do you know? Yeah. And they'd say, where's Wayne? And I'd come and they'd say, Wayne, this is Martha. I remember one time, and this little Martha was crying, and she was all upset. And they said, Wayne, teach her how to spell her name. And I was about 3 years old. I had no idea how to spell Martha. And I just started guessing at it. And she said, no, that's not right. And we went off, and it was like I was the one that somehow had my purpose, whatever it is that you want to call it, was about teaching other people that they didn't have to be depressed because of the circumstances of their life. And I seem to always have known that.
You make a really interesting point, because so often people who are depressed or see themselves as depressed, that's part of their identity. And they have great times throughout the day, but at the end of the day, they don't remember any of it.
Yes,
and they say, oh, I'm so depressed all the time.
I think that's one of the key differences between successful and unsuccessful people, by the way, is that successful people have a tendency to really recall the good.
Yes.
They remember. I mean, I think of my days at Mrs. Scarf's house out in Mount Clemens at 231 Town Hall Road, and I think the only painful day I can ever remember was the day that her husband died. And it was just, I just didn't understand. I mean, he was there one moment and he was gone the next. And the only other one is I had appendicitis when I was a child and I got rushed to the hospital. But when I think of my time in the hospital with appendicitis in 1948, I remember the flowers, and I remember the people. I remember the nurses. There's a big black nurse who would come in and put us on her knee because they had to give us penicillin in those days in these huge, and they used dull needles and huge doses.
No.
And she was always the one who would coddle me and take it. I mean, I remember seeing my mother every day. I mean, she came to the hospital every day after working where she was, and that was just glorious. I don't remember any other part of it. And I have a tendency to do that. I've been through a divorce, and I talked to my ex-wife, who is now remarried, and I'm remarried, and our lives are in nice places, and we're very good friends and all that. But whenever we would talk about what was going on in our marriage, she would always point out all of these things that I didn't even remember. You didn't take the kid on Halloween. I said, well, I remember being there on Halloween. I don't know whether I just created this or whatever, but I look back on my marriage to my ex-wife as a wonderful time. I think she was great. We just had to move along. I've never looked back and thought, oh, isn't that awful? Never done that.
Well, you talk so much about having reality-based thinking. And yet, isn't reality based on whatever we focus on?
Oh, yeah. Reality is just what I think about all day long. We are what we think about all day long. And it's like, that's the most important learning I think I have come to over the years, is that this body that we're in is really just like it's like a garage where we park our soul, you know. It's just a place to put it, you know, and so you take good care of it and you do all of that, but this isn't what it is. I've talked often about when my grandmother died, and they weighed her just before she went to the hospital. She weighed 133 pounds, and life left her body. Her body didn't weigh any less. I mean, her very life, was invisible and weightless, as is everyone who's listening to it now. So you're just sort of trapped in this body temporarily, and you ought not to be thinking of it as who you are, but your reality is how you process it. And that's one of the great lessons. I was talking to one of your producers, John, yesterday about somebody here who had come up to me and was very negative toward me, which is very rare. Do I ever attract anything like that? So this morning I was meditating on that, thinking, why did I attract this negative person who was very angry at me for being on his property when I shouldn't be, or something like that? And I kept getting back in the meditation, and it's like it bothered me for a whole day. And then I was like over it in a second, satori, instant awakening. It was like, this is only a problem for you because you process it. The guy who came into your life in a negative way is just the path that he's on. Your reality is how you are living with it. You know, it's like he came in to teach you a lesson. And the lesson is that you don't have to process him like that any longer. And it was gone. I realized that it was all totally within my power to let him go and to send him love. And I did. I sent him a couple of books. I found out where he works, and you know, and I sent him a lesson. It may take him 20 years before he even reads it, or he may never get it on this path. He may have to go through it all kinds of times and carry around that arrogance. But it's not mine. I don't have to own any of that. It's a wonderful. It's the most freeing thing you have in the world, to know that you can process life any way you want to.
Now, when you say process, let's clarify that. You really mean changing the way you think about things, the way the questions you ask yourself, the way you focus.
Process it internally, absolutely,
You've gone through an incredible evolution, and in the spotlight, you know, since 1976, I guess, is when your first book came out, right? And I was just a kid. I was 16 watching you, but I remember seeing you on TV. Yes.
I got sandals older than you. What am I doing in this interview?
But I remember watching you on television and thinking, that guy's hot. You know, this guy really, he's saying what's really true. You know, you didn't have anything else about you but what you really felt, and you were so clear in your communication that it stunned people.
Yeah, it was true. But, I had a sort of a, not arrogance, but an enormous amount of confidence.
Yes.
That,
they didn't know how to deal with that.
No. I can remember being on the Donahue Show and the Tonight Show and a few shows like that, and saying things that they were so shocked at that they asked me to come back the next week. You know? And I wasn't doing it for shock value. It was literally what I'd been saying all my life, only I just had a bigger audience. I mean, I'd been saying it as a school teacher, and I'd been saying it as a college professor, and at the lectures that I gave. And
you were a therapist for a while, too, right?
Oh, yeah, for many, many years.
Now, what made you decide to write a book in the beginning?
Writing is the way I just express my soul. Writing isn't something I do. Writing is something that I am, and therefore it just comes out. I have to write. I mean, like Picasso had to paint, you know, and or it's like asking my wife, you know, why are you such a great mother? You know, I mean, mothering is who she is, and she's just absolutely divine at it. Writing I've been doing since I wrote my first novel when I was about 15 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, and when I was in the Navy, I spent 4 years in the military after high school, and I wrote 3 books while I was in the service. None of them were ever published. And I wrote maybe 100 essays, mostly on the things that I found objectionable about the military. You know,
that's probably why they weren't published.
And I would design ways to get around it without being beaten down by it, because I realized I couldn't beat the United States government and the United States Navy, and I couldn't give speeches about how absurd it was. But I also didn't have to be inspected. You know, where they would come along and stand you up and make you, you know, shine your shoes in a certain way. I just figured out in my mind, which is where everything begins, in your mind, how could I get away with not ever getting inspected again and still be a part of this system? And in 4 years, I never had another inspection after I left boot camp.
How did you pull that off?
Every time an inspection would come along, I would figure out a way to be someplace else, where it would absolutely be necessary for me to be someplace else. The only time that I was a little bit devious was when I had somebody, when I tempted somebody to steal my shoes so that I couldn't go. I had to leave them out, but I would rather have lost my shoes and buy a new pair than to
a man who needs to express his individuality and freedom anyway, whatever is necessary.
This is true. It absolutely
is
that's true.
Fantastic.
And I left the service knowing that I wouldn't ever go back to that. And it was the great lesson of being in the military.
Yeah.
The great lesson is that life, in your life, you have to learn not only what you love, but what you don't love. And you have to experience, I think, what you don't like, and then know it, and then know how to go beyond that.
And spend the time in the place you want to live and how you want to be.
Yeah.
That's neat.
Yeah.
I know when you put your first book together. Well, first of all, can I mention what you shared with me downstairs?
Sure, you can mention anything.
Oh, I appreciate that. I got a chance to visit with Wayne downstairs in his room where he's doing his writing here in Hawaii, and I was amazed. There are some similarities between us, but I think maybe even more extreme on your part. And that was when I'm writing, I'm constantly pulling out all kinds of ideas from many different sources, but there are like 50 or 60 books strewn out all around where Wayne sits and writes.
Yeah.
And he bounces along and pulls from each of these. Now, why don't you describe a little bit about how you write, because I think it's how you live. There's a great deal of trust there.
It's called surrendering. I learned to do it about 10 years ago when I really honed this, and that was when I was speaking in Houston. There were about 3,500 people who had all paid a lot of money to come and hear me, and it was an evening with Wayne Dyer. And I had all my notes all arranged in exactly the way I wanted to, and everything was just exactly perfect. I was backstage doing the pacing that you do before you go on, and the meditating and the breathing, and just getting yourself relaxed, and your sort of divine guidance that you're seeking. And I realized that I didn't have my notes. They were gone.
Yes.
And they were back in the hotel room, which was 30 minutes away, and I was going on in 10 minutes. So I walked out on stage without any notes for the first time, and I surrendered. In that 10-minute period of time, I just said, all right, you know what you're doing, and you know how to do it, and you're good at this, and you're here for a reason, and there are 3,501 people in this room, and you're the one who's speaking, and 3,500 have paid to come and hear you. There must be a reason for that, and so get on purpose. Get on purpose. Get off of your outcome. Get off of how well you do. Get off of how much money you're being paid. Get off of all of that, and get on to what are you here for?
Yeah.
And you're here to improve the quality of life for somebody else. That's all you can do. When you leave this planet, the measure of your life won't be in what you accumulated. It will be in what you gave. Since you can't get anything anyway, it's in giving. So I surrendered, and that was the beginning for me of surrendering. I've never used notes since in my life. It's not that I'm not prepared. I meditate before, and I know what I want to do, and I do that now with my writing. It gets to a point where you absolutely have a knowing. There's 2 ways to learn. One way is through fear and doubt, and so you learn through suffering, or another way is to learn through knowing, just an absolute knowing that you have guidance available to you, and that you're not alone, and that you can handle this, and that
you have a choice to feel that way right now, no matter what's happening in the environment.
Absolutely. So I surround myself with the people and the books and the ideas and the things that I want. And I know that they will be there. I have an idea so I know the areas I want to write about, and the areas of prosperity and creating health in your life and in your relationships and in your relationship to yourself and these kinds of things. I know about that.
Right.
So I know what my chapter titles are and my headings are and things like that. And the rest of it, I just absolutely trust. And when I stop, I was going to say stuck, but I don't get stuck. I don't have anything called writer's block anymore. I can write forever. I mean, my typewriter just goes and goes and goes. And sometimes it goes so fast that it smokes. I mean, it's just going.
Well, part of the problem is you got a typewriter there.
Right.
That's an interesting point. You got a typewriter down there. Is it the same typewriter you used to write your original book?
Yeah, it's the same typewriter. I've written everything I've ever written.
A Smith Corona.
It's an old one. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
well, you talk about living in the now. Now there are computers, Wayne.
Yeah,
What's the deal
know.
here? Why do you stay with the typewriter?
I have a thing about computers. I have some judgment there that I probably have to work on. But
you got to forgive your computers.
I do. Yeah, they collect so much information. There's sort of a big brotherish kind of thing about computers.
Something that can take away freedom.
Yes,
huh?
yeah. There is something like that, and it's like you press a button, and everything that you ever did when you wet your pants back. I know it's written in there somewhere. You know? All of the skeletons I have in my closet are in somebody's computer.
So you don't want to contribute to that.
Could be paranoia, but maybe not. But anyway, it's this trusting that you get to that allows you to not just to write well or not just to speak well, which is what I do, but whether you're driving a cab or whether you're a dentist or whatever. It's what they call flow. Have you seen the book Flow?
Yes, I have.
It's not I can't pronounce the author's name, but it's Zizagakablinsky or something like that. But it's a fabulous, the whole notion that you get past judgment, and I do this in my tennis. I play tennis every day at a pretty decent club level. And I have found my best tennis flows from when I'm off of outcome and I'm on purpose, when I'm just out there being. You know?
What I'm impressed by you is to see your children, because your children live by flow.
Yeah, they do.
You know, I mean, when you walk in there and they attack you and love you and jump all over you and say, well, you know, that was my highlight. Meeting you was wonderful, but we've met before.
Yes, that's right.
Meeting your kids is really the peak experience. I got to tell you.
But you see, they're like that because my wife Marcy is like that, and I'm like that.
Yes.
Our relationship is like that.
Yes.
And I really believe that children emulate what they see around them. If you want to teach your children, you don't have to read a lot of books about how to do it. You just have to model what it is you'd like them to become. Just be that around them all the time. We get on a plane. Now, we've been coming here to Hawaii since those children were infants. All right? They were conceived. All of them were conceived right here in Hawaii. I mean, this is a very, very special, magical place.
You better be careful.
Yes, I know. We're sweating that out right now.
An eighth child.
Yeah, right.
Oh, my gosh.
But when we get on the plane, we live in Florida. Now we come to Hawaii. Now that's halfway around the world, all right? That's a 13-hour deal. And when we get in the back of a plane, we fill up a plane. Those children, every single time, we never give them any instructions. We never tell them you have to be good, you better not say anything, or we're going to get you, or anything like that. We just get on the plane. And when we get off, everybody on the plane always comes up to us and talks about all of our children and how wonderful they are. Yeah. They're there, they're in the moment, they enjoy the plane. If there's a movie, it doesn't matter if they've seen it 16 times. They watch the movie, they're playing with the stereo stuff, they're listening to stuff, they walk around, I mean, but they're always very peaceful, they're very joyful, and they meet other people on the plane, and they even calm down other babies around them. Just like they say about Christ, you know, or Mother Teresa. And that all comes from the kind of relationship that my wife and I have. And
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that most people try and teach their kids what to do, but they live a different lifestyle. And kids don't listen to what you say. They do what you do.
And telling their kids, now you shouldn't use drugs. Or they're cheating on their income tax and talking about it. I can't understand why their children lie.
No kidding.
They don't get it.
No kidding. No kidding. Tell me, I know you have a discipline of running, and you were doing that right before this interview.
Yes.
You've been doing it every day for how long?
In October of this year, I will have completed 15 years without missing a day of running a minimum of 8 miles.
That's amazing.
And as a result of doing that, and meditating along with it, I haven't had a day of illness in 15 years. I've had a few fevers, I've had a few this and that, a few sniffles, but I haven't had anything, any influenza, any colds, anything that would keep me from running that distance. And I've had I'm an athlete, so I've had some bad injuries to my legs and all of that, but I've always been able to run right through them. And instead of it taking weeks and weeks and weeks for these pulls and these injuries to heal, they're usually healed in a day or two. Because I think circulation is not only the key to understanding the universe, it's the key to understanding the universe that you are. You've got to keep yourself circulating all the time. You can't let an old person move into your body. You know?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
I say behind every old person is a young person saying, what the heck happened?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I remember when I was teaching psychology, I came across a great poster. It was a whole line of babies, with little faces, and they were all gurgling and laughing, and just like the ones that you just saw downstairs.
Yes.
And then underneath it were another row of picture was all these old people who were just all sitting there and depressed and looking down and unhappy and with scowls on their face. And the heading said, "What happened?"
Yeah. Let me ask you, what is your major focus of what you're trying to share now? Or let me come back to what I started to ask you earlier. I said, you've gone through a tremendous evolution. How do you perceive that evolution in your own life over the last 15 years or so?
The evolution is one of, instead of teaching people how to manage their emotions or how to avoid being victimized, I think it's the difference between self-help and self-realization, I guess. What I write about is always just a reflection of what I'm going through in my life. My writing is always very personal. The examples come out of my own experience in my own life. And my life has undertaken a dramatic transformation from a person who used to be a human being having a spiritual experience, as I said, to a spiritual being having a human experience. And I know,
profound difference there.
Yes, it is. And I know that who I am is divine. I'm a divine necessity. And each person listening is as well. And I know that there's a grand purpose, a heroic mission that every one of us has on this planet. And I think that my lessons have been much more spiritual, much more peaceful. Consequently, my life has become much more peaceful. And when my life is in harmony and serene, then my writing is that way. I think my writing flows more now. I think my message is that I know I'm not alone. I know that. And I guess if I know I'm not alone and I can go to a higher place within myself, that I believe that anybody can. That the same intelligence that flows through you is the same intelligence that flows through me. The only reason that I can't wiggle your finger is because I believe that I'm separate from you. But it's a oneness that is there. And I've met a beautiful, beautiful man. His name is Deepak Chopra.
Oh, yes. In fact, we met him recently, and he's invited us to come out and visit
Deepak and I
him,
have become very, very friendly.
Incredible man.
Yeah, he is. And as a matter of fact, my wife just was diagnosed as having a cold nodule on her thyroid and was told that it was 2.5 centimeters and that she would have to have surgery. She went to 3 different endocrinologists, specialists, and each of them said that she would have to have surgery. And that same day I met Deepak, the same day that we thought that my wife might have cancer. They said it could be cancerous and they couldn't take a chance. And that very same day, Deepak and I were doing a program together in Seattle, and along with Louise Hay and Shakti Gawain and Kriyananda, and it was a very, very special day. And Deepak and he came to me. Here's this man who's a physician and who grew up, studying under Maharishi. I mean, just a brilliant man. And I'm ready to just bow to him, and he's bowing to me, telling me how much he loves me and how much he appreciates my work and all that. And we became like soul brothers. I mean, it was like a man I experienced love for instantaneously. And he invited Marcy to come up to his Ayurvedic medicine place up in Lancaster, Massachusetts. And she spent a week up there for the first time in 10 years that she slept alone, that she has been away from the children or away from me. And she went up there alone, and our 16-year-old daughter, we absolutely knew that she could handle this. And she handled 5 children for a week and just became, an unbelievable mother, from sort of a wild kind of teenager who likes to go out and be a teenager, to a totally, completely responsible person, because we believed that she could do it.
Yes.
And my wife went up there for a week and worked with Deepak, and he gave her herbs and oils and
cleansed her system.
She came back, and in 1 week's time, Tony, she went back to the 3 endocrinologists, and the cold nodule is gone.
That's fantastic.
It's gone.
That's fantastic.
But she never believed for a second. I mean, it isn't like she said, "Oh, maybe I have cancer," but it wasn't like that. She absolutely said, "I'm not having surgery. I'm not interested in this. I know that I can do this. I know I can get rid of this. And all I have to do is just get my body balanced." And that's what Ayurveda taught her. Yes. That's what Deepak. So we're doing a program together. East meets West, kind of. And he said to me, he said, "It's real interesting." He said, "I came to the same conclusions about personal transformation and spirituality and this divineness." He said, "I was raised in that tradition, and I went through medicine, and I'm a scientist." He said, "You grew up on the streets of Detroit, and you came to the same kind of conclusions." And
truth is truth.
Yeah, and it's like, here we are now talking about various levels of higher consciousness, the different levels that you can reach in your life, and it's been magnificent. It's really been a joy to be associated with him. And that's really the difference between now and then. I mean, you talk about the transformation. The real difference is that I know I'm not alone now, and I know that there's a divineness that's in all of us.
What triggered that knowingness? Because so many people know it intellectually, but they don't embody it emotionally.
I try to think of what it, like what, because we're always looking for things in the physical world that describe, what it is that happened. But there's a word in Zen tradition called satorai. We don't have a translation for it in English because we don't do it.
That's a real good point. Yeah. We don't have a word, we don't have an experience.
That's right. But it's like, in Japanese it's called shibumi. It's effortless perfection, or instant awakening. And where you just have this knowing, and it's like I can go back and I could give you right here a whole lot of circumstances that happened in my life when I went to my father's grave, but then it turns out that I had all this hatred towards my father for all these years.
Don't run through this story, because this is an important story.
Yeah.
Maybe you can share that with us, because I know it was a profound experience in your life.
It truly was.
When was this, first of all?
It was 1974, just before I wrote Erroneous Zones, like months before I wrote Erroneous Zones, like days before I wrote Erroneous Zones.
Had you seen him at any time since he left your family?
Never saw him.
Never saw him?
Never saw him. He
Period.
He left and walked away on a wife and 3 boys, and never ever showed up again. Just was gone. Do you want me to tell the story?
Yeah, would you? I think it's very powerful.
It was. I went down to Columbus, Mississippi. I was teaching at St. John's University in Queens. You were 14. No, that's right. And it's interesting. I haven't thought of this in quite a while. I had a cousin who was my father's sister's child, whose name was Dorothy Phillips, who I had just met a couple of times. They would never give any information about my father. I was always looking for my father. I spent a lot of time looking for my father.
Why did you want to find him?
I wanted to meet him in a bar. I had a fantasy of just going to a bar and sitting down and saying, "I'm your son. Let me." And this was long before I became well known or anything.
Yes.
This was I just wanted to know who this guy was.
Yeah.
When his mother died, I found out his mother died. I went to the funeral, and I was only 13. I was the only one that went, and I went only because I was hoping that he would show up. Just so I could meet him, but he didn't come.
Wow.
Anyway, I spent a lot of time looking for him. Then I would always run out of money, or I would run out of desire, or I was just being guided to stay away. Because I know now. See, I can just interject that I know now because I have conversations with my father, and I can see my father in my meditations. I mean, his soul is there, and in many ways it guides me. I mean, I really think that his life was a lesson for me in how not to do things. Yeah. And so I've used it that way, and I see the blessing there. But anyway, 1974 rolls around. I'm 34 years old, and I go down to, I'm invited to go to Columbus, Mississippi to do an investigation of the civil rights legislation that had been just passed in the 60s when Johnson was president, and to see whether some of these colleges in the South were abiding by them. And I was just like a federal consultant, and I would go on campus sort of incognito, and I would sit in classes, and I would write my report, and then I would send it back. And I agreed to do this for a weekend, and Dorothy, meantime, had called and left a message that she said, "Your father is dead." And I didn't know this up until then. Wow. Yeah, she said, "Your father is dead. He died in New Orleans." And she gave me the date that he died. And she said, "He's been dead for a while." And it was a shock. I called my mother. I said, "Did you know that?" I asked none of us knew that. He'd been dead 7 or 8 years. So I got down to Columbus, and I looked on a map, and I was only 200 miles from New Orleans, and I called the infirmary where she gave me the name of the infirmary, and he was an indigent, and they said they found out that he died of cirrhosis of the liver, and he was 49 years old, and they said we don't have any record of where his body as an indigent was just shipped to Biloxi, Mississippi. So I said, "Well, I'm going to Biloxi." I was on a journey then, and this was a spooky time for me, and it gives me that Kundalini feeling right now.
I can see it. I can feel it.
Yeah, it's like I get very teary when I think about it, and I went to the rent-a-car place, the National Rent-a-Car, and there was only one rent-a-car place, and this is a dinky little town in Mississippi. Okay, at the Mississippi State College for Women, I think it was, and I went to the rent-a-car place, and they had one car, and the car was a brand new car. It was a 1974 Dodge Coronet. Okay, it was a blue, and it had no miles on it. 0.9. I said, what, did they make this car here? How did this car get here? And that car had been shipped in that day, and I was the first person to drive the car. And it was, in fact, it was so new that the plastic was on the seats. All right?
Wow.
And I had to take the plastic off of the covering.
Interesting
on the
metaphor, huh?
Yes, right. Yeah. So I got in, and there was no seat belt. There was only one seat belt. On the right-hand side, there was no left-hand seat belt. And they didn't even have shoulder belts in those days. So I got out of the car, and I took this, because I've got that sort of determination in me that I'm wearing a seat belt. And I got out of the car, and I took the seat right out of the car and put it on the ground, and there was the other seat belt taped to the floorboard of the car. And it was masking tape. It was wrapped in plastic, the buckle, wrapped in all this plastic. There was a rubber band around it, and then it was taped to the floorboard, obviously to protect it from cutting the upholstery in transit. And I took all of this stuff off of it and unwrapped it and all that, and inside the buckle, there's a card, and it says, a business card, inside the buckle of this brand new car. This is a true story. And it said, Candlelight Inn, Biloxi, Mississippi. So I took the card, and I just said, that's interesting. I'm going to Biloxi. It's 200 miles away, a 4-hour drive. It was on a Friday afternoon. I put the card in my pocket, and I drove down to Biloxi. And I didn't think much about it. In fact, I picked up a hitchhiker on the way, and a kid who was, a migrant fruit picker, and I took him someplace else, and I went about an hour out of my way to take him somewhere. And we finally got to Biloxi. I got to Biloxi, and it was about 10 minutes to 5 on Friday afternoon. I think it was the 22nd of August. Reader's Digest did this in a story because, so they checked out every detail of this, okay? I mean, every detail.
Oh.
And I went to the phone book in the gas station outside of Biloxi. When it said, welcome to Biloxi, I went into the next desk, and I just looked under cemeteries. I was just figured he's got to be buried in Biloxi. What else would they do with him, you know? And I didn't realize that I was on a real journey at this time. And I called the first cemetery, and there was no answer. And the second one, it was busy. And the third one was a real small listing, like it was an inferior cemetery. You know? Maybe they didn't bury them real deep or something. I don't know. But it was like a real tiny list. So I called it, and it turns out it was just a cemetery plot on the back of another piece of property. And an old man came to the phone. And they kept their records in Coca-Cola can boxes. The Coca-Cola can. He had to go back. He said, well, we don't have records here exactly. I said, I want to see if a Melvin Lyle Dyer is buried here. And he was gone for what seemed like an eternity, but he came back and he said, yes. He said, he's buried here. And my heart was just beating as fast as you could imagine. I said, well, how do I get there? I'm in Biloxi, and I want to come over there. I really feel like I need this. It's my father, and I've never met him. And he said, well, I got the death certificate right here. He said, he's buried. He said, your father's buried on the grounds of the Candlelight Inn.
Oh, my gosh.
And he said, just find that, and it's just inside of town. And I reached into my pocket. It's a true story.
That's incredible.
And I took the card, and on the back of the card is a map imprinted on how to get to the Candlelight Inn. I mean, it's printed. It's got these arrows that go to... And I was only 6 blocks away, and I put it back, and that's when I started getting the BGBs, whatever you call them, heebie-jeebies. And I went to the gravesite, and this was in August of 1974, and I stood there. I was 34 years old, and I stood there, and I was sobbing. There was just a little plate on the ground. It said, Melvin Lyle Dyer. And I sobbed, and I sobbed, and I cried, and I talked, and I was there for 2.5 hours. It was almost like there was magnets on my feet. I couldn't leave. It was until 7:30. In fact, there was no entrance there. I just had to. There was just a chain across there. He asked me. He said, "When you leave, just put the chain up across, because they didn't want other vandals and that driving through there." And I left there, and what I did in that time, which was so significant for me, and it's why I think of it as an event that was like an unfolding in my life.
Spiritual awakening.
Yeah, it was a spiritual awakening. It was like I forgave my father. That's what I had to do. And I think of forgiveness. I mean, I've studied this now, and I wrote a whole chapter about it, and you'll see it when you believe it. Forgiveness, Mark Twain had a wonderful definition of it. He said, forgiveness is the fragrance that the violet sheds on the heel that has crushed it. Isn't that beautiful?
Ooh, that is about as beautiful thing I've ever heard. Oh, that's amazing.
And it's like, I think of forgiveness as like a snake bite. You know, it's like you get bit by a snake and you can't unbite yourself. I mean, but nobody ever died from a snake bite. A snake bite doesn't kill you, it's just a bite, you know, and we get bit all the time in all different metaphorical ways. What kills you isn't the bite, it's the venom that circulates after the bite.
Yes.
Well, mentally or metaphysically, the venom that circulates in you after the bite, after the things that have been done to you, is the hatred and the anger and the unforgiveness. And you think of Christ on a cross, and you think of a soldier, remember from King of Kings. I'll never forget that image.
Yes.
And Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. What he's really saying there is, they don't know that they're throwing a spear into themselves when they throw a spear into me, that we're all connected, that we're all one. And until you get rid of that venom, it will destroy you. So whatever it was that I was carrying around towards my father, which was being manifested in all kinds of conscious and unconscious ways in my life, I let it go in that moment. And it was like my father was there with me, Tony. I mean, he was just, and he's with me now. I mean, in fact, I can feel his presence here now as we speak. Always saying to me, like, where I am, there's no judgment. You know, there's no good or bad here. There's no right or wrong in this. There's just like, tell my story if it's going to help somebody to forgive somebody, you know. And that was my purpose. And every time I do something that is generous and loving and good and helpful to other people, I feel like my father's smiling on me. And once I forgave him, it's funny because in my life at that time, that's when I was getting divorced. I was going through a struggle. That's when I was overweight, like 25 or 30 pounds. I wasn't running. I didn't start running till the year after that. And my writing was really suffering. I was writing professional article stuff just to publish or perish, okay? That's where I was. I was trying to get published in different professional magazines and all of that kind of thing. And I'd send stuff in. It was just stuff that, you wouldn't want to read because it was just quoting everything else. And it was, the kind of professional stuff that everybody does. They write to each other. Nobody else reads it. And then when you do write something that appears in Family Circle or Reader's Digest or whatever, or even the National Enquirer,
that's right.
5 million people read it. I mean, give me 5 million neurotic people reading the Enquirer to fix.
That's right.
Rather than a whole bunch of people who are just going to write back in another letter to me only in the form of another article. So I let all of that go. And I went back, and Erroneous Zones I wrote in 18 days.
In 18 days?
18 days.
Wow.
18 days. And there's 22 million of those in print today.
That's amazing. Yeah.